The hidden reason why 90% of Tibet is empty. A steel gate shudders, inches open, and a wall of glacial water surges into a narrow gorge of the Yarlung Tsangpo. Downstream turbines whine. Up on the plateau, the wind carries nothing, no engines, no crowds, just thin air over miles of empty land. 90% of Tibet sits unpeopled, and it's not only because breathing hurts here, it's useful. Rivers that feed billions start in this silence. Borders harden along a high, thin frontier. One relocation order turned a roaming life into a street address. To see why this emptiness became strategy and why it keeps working, we have to start with how the plateau was born. The plateau that shouldn't exist, geological trap. To understand the politics, we need the rock. Around 50 million years ago, the Indian tectonic plate slammed into Eurasia and kept pushing. That collision didn't just raise mountains, it hoisted an entire region into the sky. The Tibetan Plateau is a superplateau, 2.5 million square kilometers, averaging over 4,000 meters in elevation. An uplift so extreme it bends climate, rivers, and lives. The crust here thickened like bread dough under pressure, stacking slices of rock into towering ranges. Himalaya to the south, Kunlun and Kilian to the north, Karakoram to the west. The result is not just tall, it's high everywhere. At that altitude, physics sets the rules. Oxygen drops to roughly 60% of sea level. Bodies move slower, thinking gets fuzzy, pregnancies risk complications. Long-term residents adapt with larger lung capacity and higher hemoglobin, but newcomers pay a steep acclimatization tax. Sunlight slices through thin air with potent UV. Winters arrive early, summers are brief, and soil stays cold. Permafrost underlies huge swathes, locking moisture out of reach and turning the ground into a seasonal trap. Rock-hard in winter, waterlogged and unstable when thawed. That alone throttles dense settlement. Farming needs a predictable growing season, but here, frost can bite in any month. Barley, potatoes, and hardy buckwheat survive in pockets, yet the plateau doesn't hand out surplus easily. Livestock do better, yaks, sheep, and goats roam for forage, but herding spreads people thin by design. Too many hooves in one place and the grass fails. So mobility becomes the safety net. Move with the seasons, share pasture risk, and survive the lean years. Meanwhile, the place that looks like a desert stores water like a vault. Snowfields and glaciers bank monsoon bounty, then melt it out through the dry months. This is the water tower of Asia. The Indus, Sutlej, Brahmaputra, Salween, Mekong, Yangtze, and Yellow all catch their first breath here. But there's a paradox. When the summer monsoon climbs the Himalaya, it spills rain on the southern slopes, then wrings itself out. The plateau interior often stays stark and cold-dry, while its edges cradle the moisture. That asymmetry means some valleys carry green, while open plains stay brown. Livable pockets prove the point. Lhasa and its basin sit lower than the high ridges, shielded from blasts of Arctic air and the full brunt of monsoon storms. River terraces along the Kirchu offer enough heat and water for fields, and south-facing slopes nurse small microclimates. Elsewhere, rain shadows behind big ranges lean into calmer skies and manageable wind. These are the nodes where towns took root, centuries before asphalt arrived, where pilgrims, traders, and monks could make a living on barley, butter, and exchange. The plateau's hazards never clock out. The same collision that built it keeps shaking it. Faults creep and sometimes jump, earthquakes that shiver stone houses and crack roads. Steep slopes and loose moraines feed landslides that can dam rivers in minutes and burst without warning. As glaciers retreat, lakes dammed by fragile ice and rock swell in their basins. A warm week, a heavy rain, or slope failure can trigger a glacial lake outburst flood, an icy wall that roars down a valley, silt-choked and fast. Villages learn to read the water's color, to listen for the change in its voice. Permafrost adds a quiet menace. It anchors the ground until it doesn't. Warming pushes the freeze line deeper into retreat, and what used to be solid slumps into thaw. Roads buckle, embankments leak heat, rails need insulation, and buildings demand special foundations. Every kilometer costs more, every repair is a negotiation with ground that's literally changing state. Even where permafrost is patchy, the unpredictability raises the price of permanence. Settling widely across this terrain isn't just hard, it's expensive to maintain forever. Add wind. At 4,000 to 5,000 meters, air is thin and fast. Dust lifts easily, scours fields, and strips moisture. Farmers plant windbreaks where they can, but trees grow slowly in cold soils. Add UV that cracks paint and ages skin. Add a diurnal swing that can flip from sunburn to frostbite in a day. All of it stacks up into a math that punishes sprawl and rewards shelter, valley bottoms, tucked villages, walls that face the right way, and towns where services can concentrate. And yet scarcity shapes power. Land that can feed people exists, but it's threaded like beads along rivers and in basins. Whoever holds those corridors, passes, bridges, junctions, can move goods and enforce rules. Trade routes along the Yarlung Tsangpo, the Brahmaputra's Tibetan name, carried salt, wool, and stories because they were the only reliable channels. Later, roads and rails would follow the same logic. The plateau doesn't invite a carpet of villages, it invites choke points. That physical map set the limits. It explained why most of the plateau stayed open and quiet, why people moved seasonally rather than settle everywhere, and why the densest places huddled where water, heat, and shelter overlapped. But it also created an opportunity. If a government wanted to control this region without blanketing it with people, the land had already drawn the diagram. Focus on the nodes, watch the passes, keep the open spaces clear and observable. The land set the boundaries. Policy would soon carve them deeper. Frontier by policy, from empire edges to PRC incorporation. While the land drew narrow corridors, empires learned to use them. Under the Qing, Tibet sat as a high buffer more than a governed heartland. Imperial strategy treated distance as insulation. Ambans in Lhasa watched politics, monasteries managed daily life, and caravans threaded the passes. As long as tribute moved and the frontier didn't spark a crisis, loose control worked. The plateau's emptiness helped. It dulled invasion routes and slowed revolt. Control meant influence, not saturation. Then the 20th century tugged the edges. British expeditions pushed up from India, trade on paper, leverage in practice. The 1904 Young Husband Mission forced treaties that opened markets and strained the old buffer logic. Later, the similar negotiations sketched the McMahon Line in the east, a boundary Lhasa accepted on its side, but Beijing never recognized. Maps hardened where geography was still the real border. Out on the ground, lines were a rumor. A ridge, a pass, a village that moved with seasons. Those set the rhythm more than ink. Between world wars and civil war in China, authority fractured. Lhasa asserted autonomy, minted its own currency, and navigated between neighbors. Britain faded. Newly independent India inherited anxieties and treaties. For a while, the plateau's distance looked like protection again. But a state rising in the east saw vulnerability instead. For the People's Republic, declared in 1949, those highlands were a frontier to secure, not a buffer to tolerate. The logic flipped. Emptiness needed a plan. In 1951, the 17-point agreement announced Tibet's peaceful liberation and promised autonomy within the PRC. The People's Liberation Army entered not as a raid, but as an administrative project. The first moves mirrored the terrain, gripped the nodes. Garrisons and offices went up in Lhasa and Shigatse, airstrips were carved where valleys allowed, roads stitched across passes the way caravans once did. The pattern wasn't a swarm, it was a net. Towns became knots, the open land stayed open, but watched. Those early roads mattered as much as flags. The Sichuan, Tibet and Qinghai, Tibet highways clawed across permafrost and scree, hauling diesel, cement, and carders into places that had never seen a motor. Each bridge changed local economies. Caravans lost their edge. Grain and uniforms moved faster than rumor. Surveillance could travel. The state didn't need to fill the plateau to change it. It only needed corridors strong enough to move decisions uphill and resources downhill. Population strategy followed that infrastructure logic. Secure hubs first. Encourage workers, traders, and administrators into the towns. Keep the grasslands thin. Mobility that once protected herds now looked like evasion to government, mapping taxes, schools, and rules. Sedentarization would come later. At first, checkpoints and registries did the work. The emptiness beyond the highways wasn't a failure to populate, it was a choice to concentrate. There was pushback. In 1959, after tensions over reforms, taxes, and fears for the Dalai Lama's safety erupted in Lhasa, an uprising met force. The diaspora began. Monasteries, the engines of education and social life, came under tighter control. The state deepened its hold on the nodes and widened the gaps between them. In the 1960s, upheaval swept all of China. and the plateau's networks took another turn toward command. When the country later opened and reformed, those corridors stayed. New asphalt, same geometry. Here's the quiet contradiction. The PRC's core doctrine prized development and population growth, yet in Tibet, much of the land remained deliberately empty. Why preserve emptiness if numbers mean strength? Because in a place where altitude, distance, and water define leverage, emptiness can serve power. Fewer people in the hinterland make movement easier to monitor. Fewer villages near borders reduce friction during standoffs. Fewer settlements along rivers simplify dam sites, transmission lines, and resettlement plans. Meanwhile, legitimacy required building. Investment flowed to the hubs, hospitals in Lhasa, campuses, housing blocks, new markets. Subsidies sweetened life where oxygen thins. Migration policy added layers, encouraging cadres and technical workers to rotate through while pushing herders to settle for services. The plateau's economy shifted toward nodes by design. The empty spaces didn't disappear. They receded behind checkpoints and policy goals. External borders pulled on this strategy. Undefined lines in the west and east with India, a long seam with Nepal and Bhutan, each demanded roads, depots, and airfields at altitude. Emptiness near those edges became a buffer no insurance company could price. If a crisis flared, there were fewer civilians at risk, fewer evacuations, fewer hostages to escalation. Troops could maneuver on roads meant for both freight and force. The landscape amplified that logic. High passes are narrow, valleys funnel movement. Control them, and you don't need to occupy the plains. But the pivotal lever sat in the riverbeds. The same corridors that carried subsidies could carry turbines. Upstream of nations downstream, dams promised power and timing control. To use that leverage, the state needed securable headwaters more than sprawling towns. Emptiness helps keep a grip on headwaters. Patrols see farther. Projects face fewer local vetoes. A sparse map is easier to redraw. This was the moment policy met terrain and chose the same lines. The empire had buffered by absence. The modern state buffered by corridors. Emptiness didn't vanish, it was curated. And because the plateau's rivers reach far beyond its borders, that curation wasn't only domestic. It set the stage for upstream advantage. Emptiness, leveraged through water, height, and distance, would become a quiet instrument of power. The water tower of Asia, headwaters as leverage. Follow the rivers and you follow power. Up here, 7 great systems pick up their first threads. The Indus and its Sutlej arm to the west. The Brahmaputra born as the Yarlung Tsangpo, slicing east before it U-turns into India. The Salween and Mekong dropping through gorges toward Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The Yangtze and Yellow turning China's heartland green and then brown with silt. They don't just pass through the plateau, they're made by it. What this means upstream is simple. Timing decides fortunes. A dam gate opened a week earlier can shave the top off a flood downstream. A gate held closed can store the pulse for when grids need megawatts at dusk or fields need a steadier trickle in April. None of this changes how much water falls from the sky over a year, but it does change when it arrives and at what speed. In places where farmers set planting by river height or fishers time nets by dry season flow, that calendar is everything. On the Yarlung Tsangpo, the Zangmo Hydropower station anchored the first cascade on the Tibetan side, part of a ladder of dams including Gyatso, Gyacha, and Jiksu. These are run-of-river plants, which means they generally don't hold back years of water, but their reservoirs can still shift daily and weekly rhythms. Downstream in India, after the river becomes the Siang and then the Brahmaputra, small changes in shoulder season flow can tilt power generation plans and irrigation schedules. After the Brahmaputra slows into the Assam plains, silt is a blessing and a burden. Timing alters how much is spread and where it settles. Eastward, the Mekong offers a clearer lesson. Its headwaters rise in Tibetan ranges before cutting south into Yunnan and then through mainland Southeast Asia. China's upstream dams, Xirao, Nujiadu, and others, have been shown to buffer floods and also intensify dry season low flows when reservoirs store water for power. Communities on the Tonle Sap, the lake that famously reverses flow with the Mekong's pulse, feel those shifts in fish catches and planting patterns. When the upstream calendar slides, boats come back lighter and markets reflect it. Upstream advantage isn't just concrete, it's information. Gauges high on the plateau see floods early. Data shared or withheld becomes leverage. Between China and downstream countries, there are memoranda of understanding for flood season data sharing, but no basin-wide binding treaties along the lines of the Indus Waters Treaty. On the Brahmaputra, India and China exchange hydrological data at certain stations during monsoon months. On the Mekong, China is not a full member of the Mekong River Commission, but provides data through the Lancang-Mekong Cooperation Framework. Those arrangements help, but they're patchwork. They leave room for suspicion when flows don't match expectation. For states downstream, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, the stakes are concrete and human. Pakistan's canals feed from the Indus, whose snowmelt signature starts in Tibetan and Karakoram ice. India's northeast knows the Brahmaputra as both lifeline and threat. A swollen monsoon brings fertile silt and sudden ruin. Bangladesh lives inside a delta that breathes with seasonal pulses. The right kind of flood is life. The wrong timing is disaster. Lower Mekong villages set their year by a river that used to be more predictable than the price of rice. When timing shifts, costs show up not only on hydrographs, but in calories, cash, and migration. Inside China, the story is twin-headed. The Yangtze's upper reaches rise in the plateau's cold, and its flow supports hydropower giants downstream. The Yellow River's sediment, much of it loess, some from plateau headwaters, has always complicated management. More storage upstream can modulate flow, but can't erase 1,000 years of silt. For Beijing, upstream control is national security wrapped as development. Power for factories, water for cities, and flood control for megadeltas where tens of millions live. There's the unbuilt spectre too, diversions. Proposals have circulated for years about transferring Brahmaputra headwaters north or east toward drier basins. The grandest schemes would punch tunnels through rock that makes engineers sweat. None of those mega-diversions exist in practice on the Yarlung Tsangpo, and official messaging emphasizes hydropower, not interbasin transfer. Still, the idea shapes anxieties. If upstream can time water, could it someday reroute it? Even rumors move politics. Zoom back to the cascade logic. In narrow gorges, the most efficient plants sit close together. Each dam flattens turbulence for the next, squeezing more electricity from the same drop in elevation. But cumulative effects ripple downstream. Peaking operations can send daily surges. Sediment gets trapped, starving floodplains of nutrients. Fish migration routes shrink unless ladders or bypasses actually work at this scale. In the Mekong Basin, studies have tied upstream peaking to unusual low flows in recent drought years, even as official releases cited limited storage. On the Brahmaputra, India's planned dams in Arunachal Pradesh are framed as counterweights, catch what China modulates, add flexibility on the Indian side. Meanwhile, climate change is reshuffling the deck. Glaciers are retreating, snowlines are rising, and permafrost is thawing. In the near term, meltwater boosts flow, a deceptive bonus. Later, as ice stocks shrink, dry season baseflow could fall. For upstream planners, that argues for more storage to smooth volatility. For downstream farmers, it argues for transparency and rules so that a thinner glacier century doesn't also mean a thinner harvest. All of this loops back to emptiness. To hold the water, you need to hold the heights and the rails to reach them. Fewer settlements along headwaters simplify land acquisition, resettlement, and security. Patrols can watch valleys where the only movement is scheduled. Maintenance crews can reach gates without weaving through village politics. The plateau's open spaces, which once kept people moving, now keep projects manageable. Control of timing, backed by concrete and corridors, turns geography into quiet power. Steel over sky, railways, roads, and controlled corridors. Steel had to learn to breathe thin air. When planners drew the Qinghai-Tibet Railway from Xining to Lhasa, they weren't just laying track, they were solving altitude. Engines lose power where oxygen thins, so locomotives came with turbocharging tuned for 5,000 meters. Passenger cars got pumped with supplemental oxygen. Under the rails, permafrost wanted to heave and slump, so engineers lifted the track on embankments, slid thermosiphons into the ground to wick heat upward, and spread crushed rock to vent the cold. It wasn't elegant, it was relentless pragmatism. Keep the line straight, keep the ground frozen, keep trains on time. When the line opened, it stitched a continent to a rooftop. Diesel, grain, rebar, and people began moving in measured pulses. But notice where the steel goes. It hugs valleys, skirts basins, and touches only where towns already hold. Lhasa turned from a highland capital into a logistics hub. Depots stacked with pipes, transformers, and fuel drums anchored a new tempo. The vast hinterland stayed mostly untouched because the railway wasn't built to populate the empty. It was built to feed the nodes that control the empty. Extensions pushed the logic forward. West to Shigatse, the track ran along the Yarlung Tsangpo Valley, lowering the cost of moving cement and turbines to hydropower sites. East to Nyingchi, it crept toward the deep gorges where the river becomes a strategic question for two countries at once. Each spur is a statement. Densify junctions, leap between them, and leave distances open. Roads mirror the same pattern, wide, all-weather highways laid across passes, with avalanche sheds where slopes shed rock and snow, and with fiber lines zigzagging in the shadow of cutbanks. Corridor urbanization does more than move goods. It concentrates life where the state can service and see it. Hospitals, schools, housing blocks, and markets cluster by stations and highway interchanges. Subsidies and salaries pull people there, oxygen masks and heating systems keep them. Beyond the pavement, the grasslands remain thin, dotted with checkposts, radio towers, and occasional sheep pens. The emptiness isn't accidental sprawl that never happened. It's a canvas left clear so the brushstrokes, rail, road, power line, show cleanly. All of it wears a dual-use badge. A freight wagon that brings flour can bring armor. A siding that stores ballast can store fuel. Bridges designed for heavy axle loads don't ask if the wheels carry corn or tracked vehicles. On maps, the corridor is development. In contingency plans, it's a mobilization lane. Altitude punishes speed for outsiders. Acclimatization demands days. Trains shrink that penalty for those who control the timetable. A brigade pre-positioned near a siding at 3,500 meters has a home field advantage written in oxygen. Permafrost still demands rent. Summer thaw undercuts embankments. Crews inject grouted piles, add culverts, and lay reflective membranes to keep heat out of the soil. Winter frost cracks asphalt. Maintenance becomes governance, routine, visible, unglamorous. To the west, gravel beds rattle under daily trains. To the east, tunnels through granite earn their keep by shaving hours off moves that once took days. Every fix ties the corridor tighter to the land and to the people who depend on it. The corridors also steer industry. Hydropower turbines arrive in convoys, nacelles wrapped against dust. Mines tap copper and lithium where ore meets road, not where ore hides behind 7 days of mule track. Tourism rides the rails too. Coaches full of cameras and disposable oxygen packs step off at stations landscaped like postcards. Money follows gradients of accessibility. If a place is one good road from a siding, it grows. If it's 5 days of trackless plateau, it stays a rumor. Meanwhile, power lines march alongside steel. Ultra-high voltage lines leap valleys, carrying electrons from dams toward distant grids. Substations mushroom where river meets rail yard. Timing control, the ability to open or close a gate at the right hour, needs crews on site and parts on hand. The corridor delivers both, and security with them. Fences are easier to defend than fields. Patrols need pavement, not prayer flags. For local towns, the railway changes breakfast. Vegetables arrive fresher, fuel cheaper, and wages steadier for those who can read the timetable. But the pattern holds. Growth hugs the line, silence presses against the fence. Off-corridor villages watch trucks pass but don't see them turn. That's the point. Concentration simplifies services, surveillance, and sudden decisions. It also allows planners to leave large spaces purposefully thin, buffers against wildfire, flood, or border flare. And the borders matter. Lines to Nyingchi push closer to a frontier where altitude shapes standoffs. Roads to airfields lengthen runways and shorten response times. The empty between corridors becomes a cushion, no towns to evacuate, fewer lives in harm's way if a convoy must move, fewer eyes to stir rumor. The plateau's emptiness, once a product of climate, now doubles as policy. Steel over sky doesn't erase distance. It weaponizes it, turning narrow corridors into levers that move a continent-sized highland. Faith on the plateau, monasteries, surveillance, and space. Before roads drew hard lines, monasteries drew soft ones. A monastery wasn't just a temple, it was a school, a clinic, a storehouse, a court, and a radio station long before radios. Villages tuned their seasons to its bells. Pilgrims threaded Kora circuits, circles around sacred mountains, lakes, and halls, mapping the plateau with footsteps and stories. Land grants made monasteries landlords, festivals made them calendars. Authority layered gently. Abbots settled grazing disputes, traders found safe rooms, and orphans found teachers. Then politics rearranged walls. After 1959, the uprising in Lhasa and the Dalai Lama's flight cracked the old order. The diaspora carried texts and memories south. Inside the plateau, monasteries were rebuilt under new terms. The reconstruction came with rules, registration of monks, quotas on admissions, curricula that mixed doctrine with civics, and committees that looked like boards but reported like bureaus. A monastery could still host a festival, but the permit had a schedule, and the schedule had a liaison. Space tightened, cameras sprouted on gates and corners, grid management mapped neighborhoods into cells with assigned minders. Monks carried IDs, visitors showed theirs. Rituals that once bled into markets now hugged courtyards. Pilgrimage routes crossed more fences and more checkpoints. A circumambulation that once took a day might take two because the line at a police kiosk wrapped around a stupa. Buses replaced caravans, itineraries replaced chants. Cadres moved in, not as invaders, but as roommates. Resident cadres lived alongside monks, joining study sessions, co-hosting lectures, and filling in forms that measured progress in patriotism and hygiene. Loudspeakers announced health campaigns and policy days. Surveillance blended with service. A monastery's clinic got new equipment. Its library got a camera on the door. The courtyard still smelled of butter lamps, but the lamps burned under watch. Landholding shifted. Where monasteries had once leased fields to lay families, reforms routed land through collectives and later contracts. Some houses kept their plots, others joined resettlement apartments with no soil but a balcony. Festivals moved from pastures to plazas where barriers could guide crowds and drones could film the scene. The choreography looked festive and safe. It also looked predictable. Silence crept into the gaps between checkpoints. On the open rangeland, there were fewer tents to welcome a pilgrim with tea, fewer herders to pass a rumor about a festival date change, fewer side paths worn by feet. Movement became legible to officials and costly to spontaneity. A group on a pilgrimage bus could be counted and tracked. A handful of walkers on a ridge drew attention, a camera could flag. Monasteries adapted. Some leaned into restoration, teaching crafts, digitizing manuscripts, and hosting tourists with guided tour that explained murals in 3 languages. Others deepened community roles, food relief in winter, elder care on cold nights, while keeping celebrations inside manageable courtyards. The spiritual map didn't vanish. It folded, like a long scarf tucked into a smaller chest. There were frictions. A sermon that drifted into history might be interrupted by a reminder to stay on topic. A novice's admission might hinge on a quota filled last month. A prayer wheel circuit might be paused for a security drill. But there were also continuities. Debates over doctrine continued in low voices. The same mountain peaks caught the first light. The same chants unspooled at dawn. What changed most was the relationship between faith and space. Where monasteries once extended their reach across valleys with networks of affiliated hermitages and pilgrimage stations, the new map drew faith into nodes. Town-centered rituals synchronized with train timetables and market hours. Rural shrines without cell coverage faded from calendars not because belief thinned, but because movement did. Emptiness between nodes became a compliance tool. With fewer people moving across the plateau, fewer unscripted encounters stitched communities. Fewer eyes meant fewer witnesses. Fewer gatherings meant fewer surprises. The state's argument emphasized order and service, safer festivals, fire codes, medical tents, and data to plan resources. The counter-argument lived in nostalgia and loss, a memory of a Korah done at one's own pace, of an elder's story told under stars, of a monk's blessing received in a field that no longer has a path. Between those narratives sits the quiet fact that faith travels worse under surveillance than commerce does. Trucks don't mind checkpoints, devotion does. Downstream, rivers carry silt and stories. Up here, belief carries itself if it's allowed to move. When movement shrinks, belief adapts, but it changes shape, denser in towns, thinner in the wind. On the plateau's new map, monasteries remain anchors. The emptiness around them is no longer just weather, it's policy, and in that space, rituals continue, measured, watched, and still, to those who need them, necessary. Downstream lives, India, Bangladesh, Southeast Asia dependence. Follow the Brahmaputra as it leaves the gorge and it turns from a blade to a floodplain. In Assam, the river spreads, slows, and builds sandbars that shift like migrating villages. Farmers here don't just plant by date, they plant by height, how far the water has fallen on the Ghats, how quickly the sandbars green. A week's difference in the spring pulse can mean a harvest saved or lost. When upstream dams smooth the shoulder seasons, pumps start earlier, canals fill steadier, and diesel bills drop or rise, depending on the rhythm set miles away. In Bangladesh, that rhythm is destiny. The Ganges and Brahmaputra meet and exhale into the world's largest delta. The right flood, broad, gentle, sediment-rich, feeds the soil, flushes salt, and refills ponds. The wrong flood, late, sudden, peaking high, tears levees and salts fields for years. Dry season releases matter too. When April flows thin, shallow wells pull brackish, and rice seedlings yellow. If the upstream calendar shifts, market stalls price that shift in onions, lentils, and cooking oil within days. Across the watershed, the Mekong writes the same lesson in a different script. As the river leaves Yunnan, it feeds the Tonle Sap in Cambodia, where monsoon swells reverse the lake's flow each year. When the reversal is strong, fish nurseries explode. When the pulse flattens, fishers come home light. Vietnam's delta plans its triple rice rotation around dry season water levels. A delayed or muted release upstream changes sowing dates and pushes farmers toward shrimp or fruit, bets that depend on salinity lines creeping inland under sea level rise. Downstream cities live by the hour. Dhaka, Guwahati, Phnom Penh can, though power grids lean on hydro forecasts. If evening peaking upstream pulls water to spin turbines at 6 p.m., it might leave a thinner cushion for drinking water intakes a week later. If flood warnings arrive late, buses cross a bridge that'll be underwater by midnight. Data sharing agreements help. India and China share monsoon season levels for the Brahmaputra. China uploads Langkang, Upper Mekong, data to a platform for the Lower Mekong. But the patchwork shows at the edges. A station offline, a gauge under repair, a release timed for a domestic grid can ripple into a village where the loudest machine is a boat engine. Meanwhile, treaties are uneven. The Indus Waters Treaty locks India and Pakistan into strict rules, but the Brahmaputra has no basin-wide binding pact. The Mekong River Commission coordinates among the lower states, while China, calling its reach the Langkang, engages through a parallel forum. Cooperation happens, yet when drought hits, El Niño thinning clouds, or when a new dam stages test runs, suspicion fills the space between meeting rooms and riverbanks. A farmer doesn't see a communique, he sees a sandbar where water should be. Seasonality ties into migration. In the Char Islands of Assam, families rebuild houses on stilts every few years, their kids learning carpentry before long division. In Bangladesh's coastal belt, a bad flood year sends workers north into the garment districts for months. On the lower Mekong, when fish catches collapse, young people ride motorbikes to Phnom Penh or Ho Chi Minh City and don't come back. Water timing sets off chain reactions, labor shifts, school dropouts, food price spikes that look like economics but start as hydrology. Silt is the quiet currency. Floodplains downstream need sediment to keep up with subsidence and sea level rise. Trapping silt behind dams protects turbines and canals but starves deltas. Fertility drops. Farmers buy more fertilizer, canals clog with weeds, embankments sink relative to the sea. Vietnam's engineers now juggle sluice gates to time silt pulses with sewing windows. Cambodia watches the Tonle Sap's fish-size curve bend towards smaller catches. Bangladesh dredges incessantly, chasing a moving bottom. Not all changes arrive as crisis. In Assam, managed embankments paired with early warnings let villages stage grain on higher ground. In Bangladesh, raised hand pumps keep wells alive through longer dry spells. In Laos and Cambodia, community fish refuges, small protected pools, buffer catches when river levels misbehave. But these are patches on a larger quilt stitched upstream. A single reservoir's peaking schedule can undo a dozen village committees' planning if it turns a smooth hydrograph into a sawtooth. Politics rides the current. In India's Arunachal Pradesh, plans for dozens of dams are framed as development and as counterbalance to upstream control. In Bangladesh, negotiators ask for more data earlier for longer seasons. In Cambodia and Vietnam, ministers hold up satellite charts when the river runs strangely low, pointing north. Official statements stay measured, local radio doesn't. Rumor outruns rainfall. Then climate presses. Glaciers bank less water. Monsoons wobble, arriving late, clustering in bursts or stalling. Drought years make upstream storage feel prudent. Flood years make releases feel dangerous. The near-term melt bonus, the cushioned dry seasons shrinks, and everyone downstream gets whiplash. Calls grow for basin rules that match a thinner century. Guaranteed minimum flows, coordinated peaking, sediment bypass at dams, drought playbooks, emergency fishery closures with compensation. Here's the human scale that keeps getting lost. A woman in Kurigram times her paddy transplanting to knee-deep water. A fisher on the Tonle Sap reads the lake by the sound under his paddle. A rice mill in Burasol buys diesel by the drum when grid stability falters in April. None of them can see Zangmu's gates or Zayarawan's spillways. They feel them. The plateau's emptiness, curated for control, extends its reach through rivers that carry more than water, carrying calendars, prices, and choices into kitchens and markets thousands of kilometers away. Climate squeeze, glaciers, monsoons, and the plateau heat pump. The plateau runs a fever, and the symptoms show in ice. Warming here outpaces the global average. Instruments on ridges and rooftops record it year after year. Glaciers in many basins shrink back, their tongues pulling uphill, their surfaces pitted and gray with dust. Snowlanes creep higher. What used to be a reliable spring melt becomes an earlier, shorter flush. Downstream, that looks like a bigger pulse now and a thinner trickle later. The near-term melt bonus feels generous until the savings account runs low. Ice loss doesn't just change quantity, it scrambles timing. Farmers and dam operators plan around calendars that used to line up with snowmelt and monsoon onset. Bring melt forward by 2 weeks, and canals fill when fields aren't ready. Delay the monsoon, and reservoirs stretch shoulder season releases further than they were designed for. In a system where timing is wealth, misaligned weeks cost in kilowatts, sacks of grain, and trust. Permafrost tells the same story through soil. Thermometers sunk into ground that once stayed frozen year-round now chart deeper active layers. When ice in the soil thaws, water runs off faster, slopes slump, and alpine wetlands drain or shift. Springs that fed summer pastures change course. Roads sink in slow motion. For hydrology, that means flashier peaks after storms and less sponge in the landscape to even out a dry spell. A rangeland that used to inhale snowmelt and exhale through July now coughs. Add the plateau's role in the sky. Scientists call it a heat pump, a huge elevated engine that in spring and early summer warms, rises and pulls moist air northward. That rising column helps draw the South Asian monsoon onto the subcontinent. Alter the surface, less snow, darker ground, more exposed rock, and you tweak the pump. In some models, an earlier warm-up can start the monsoon sooner, but also fragment it, bunching rain into bursts and leaving longer pauses. On the ground, that means seeds in soil that waits for a rain that now comes as a storm, not a sequence. Teleconnections, the long reach of one region's weather into another's, show up on charts and in fields. Years when the plateau warms fast can line up with erratic monsoon onset over India and Bangladesh. The eastern plateau's heat can steer moisture toward or away from the Brahmaputra's corridor, shifting who gets soaked. None of it is clockwork, it's probability, but farmers don't plant probabilities. They plant dates, and dates keep lying. Then come the sudden events that turn trends into headlines: glacial lake outburst floods. As ice retreats, it leaves behind dams made of rock and ice rubble, a poor substitute for bedrock. Lakes grow behind these walls until a heat wave, a landslide, or a heavy rain tips them over. The flood that follows is cold, fast, and full of stones. Bridges go, fields flatten, and power lines disappear into brown foam. Each outburst is local. The fear they generate is basin-wide. Black carbon adds insult. Soot from engines, stoves, and distant fires drifts onto snow, lowering its reflectivity. Dark snow absorbs more sun and melts faster. Cleaner cooking fuel in towns and better diesel controls on corridors aren't sold as glaciology, but they matter. A few % change in albedo can move the melt window enough to affect planting on fields 1,000 kilometers away. Faced with volatility, planners have two instincts. One is to build more storage, bigger reservoirs, higher dams, more small ponds to smooth out spiky flows and bank water for long dry stretches. The other is to let the land store water, protect wetlands, keep permafrost cold with vegetation cover, and manage grazing so soils hold moisture. The first option is quick, measurable, and comes with megawatts. The second is slow, local, and comes with livelihoods. Both fight the same fight against timing chaos, but they answer to different ministries and different clocks. Meanwhile, forecasts strain. Seasonal outlooks that once offered useful guidance now hedge. An El Niño or La Niña tips the odds, but the plateau's changing surface can amplify or muffle those signals. Reservoir operators hedge too, holding back when forecasts whisper drought, then getting caught by a sudden burst of rain. Downstream, that looks like empty canals one month and emergency spill the next. Trust in upstream timing erodes when the sky fails to keep its old promises. The emptiness we've been tracing becomes a climate tool. Fewer people on rangelands make it simpler to designate restoration zones, plant willow on eroding banks, and fence wetlands that act like cold reservoirs. Fewer settlements near glacial lakes reduce evacuation lists when a siren wails. Corridors, rail, road, power bundle vulnerability into strands that can be insulated, monitored, and repaired after storms. It's brittle, but it's legible. In a warming world, legibility is power. Here's the squeeze. Warming speeds the hydrologic conveyor belt just as the ice that steadied it thins. The plateau's role as Asia's water tower shifts from generous banker to strict accountant. Upstream, that argues for a tighter grip, gates, gauges, and guards. Downstream, it argues for rules that share risk. Between them lies the wind over empty land, blowing dust from slopes where summer used to linger and now rushes past. The logistics of control: oxygen, fuel, and fragility. Power at altitude is logistics with less oxygen. At 4,000 meters, every machine loses muscle. Diesel engines starve for air, turbochargers work overtime, fuel consumption climbs. A truck that hauls 20 tons at sea level crawls with 15 on these grades, needing more stops, more filters, more coolant. People burn fuel too. Acclimatization rotations cycle workers in and out to prevent high-altitude sickness. Crews sleep low when they can, work high when they must, and spend precious days just adjusting. That time is a hidden tax on every project and patrol. Winter turns that tax into debt. Passes close under wind-packed snow, black ice seals switchbacks, avalanches erase hairpins overnight. Convoys wait for mid-morning sun to bite the frost, then race the afternoon chill back. The calendar shrinks to a working season, late spring through early fall, when stockpiles must be built to survive long nights. Fuel depots sit like lighthouses along corridors, drums stacked under tarps, heaters humming to keep diesel from gelling. Every liter counts, and every missed delivery cascades through clinics, generators, and kitchens. Permafrost plays spoiler beneath it all. Tracks that rode firm ground in October turn spongy by July. Embankments slump, culverts tilt, frost heave ripples asphalt into waves that beat suspensions and stretch timetables. Maintenance becomes strategy. Thermosiphons wick heat out of soil. Reflective rock blankets keep sun from cooking the base. Crews patrol with infrared cameras, hunting warm patches that foretell failure. Governance looks like a grader scraping ruts before a supply train derails, and a county runs out of heating fuel. Communication rides similar constraints. Satellites cover the skies, but mountains cast shadows, valleys eat line of sight. Microwaves leap ridge to ridge, fiber optic cables snake along highways, and repeaters perch on passes where wind makes bolts groan. A storm knocks two towers out, and a district goes dark until crews brave whiteouts with spares. Redundancy is policy, 2 routes for data, 2 for power, backup generators in clinics and command posts. Redundancy costs money, and emptiness helps justify it when there's nothing else to lean on. Stockpiles are the plateau's insurance. Grain reserves buffer towns when trucks can't climb. Medical oxygen sits in pallets because concentrators underperform in thin air and ambulances need bottles ready. Spare rails, ballast piles, and bridge trusses live beside the line. One landslide shouldn't starve a prefecture of medicine. Even garbage has a plan, landfills sited downwind and below aquifers, fenced against dogs that wander and wildlife that tests wire. Fragility forces foresight into the mundane. Prepositioned brigades and emergency teams round out the kit. Warehouses near railheads store winter tents, fuel bladders, and rations sealed against cold. Helicopter pads sit graded at crossroads where density thins, marked with wind socks that freeze into sticks on bad days. Flight plans dance around density altitude, the invisible penalty of hot, thin air that robs rotor lift. When a storm pins rotors down, ground crews take over, chains on tires, radios crackling with dead zones mapped by memory. Emptiness simplifies some problems and sharpens others. Fewer settlements along corridors mean fewer detours for social needs during a crisis. Convoys don't stop to unload flour in every hamlet when a substation is burning. It also means fewer hands to shovel, fewer locals to spot a hairline crack in a culvert before it becomes a crater. A single bridge failure can strand an entire county because no informal network of tracks fans out across private fields. The map is clean, the failure points are bright. Fuel is the through line. Heat, mobility, communications, even water treatment depend on diesel and electricity moving on time. Tanks need insulation and stirring to fight wax crystals in deep cold. Pipelines are rare at this altitude, trucks rule, and trucks need reliable depots. When wind closes a pass, managers run spreadsheets against reality, cut street lighting to save hospital power, throttle industrial loads to keep oxygen plants alive, delay a construction pour rather than risk a convoy. Triage is standard operating procedure. Meanwhile, climate volatility multiplies uncertainty. A sudden thaw saturates slopes, a cold snap shatters brittle steel, a GLOF takes out a bridge and rewrites detour maps in an afternoon. The response script is practiced: switch to the alternate corridor, tap reserve stocks, dispatch survey drones, brief towns by loudspeaker when the cell network flickers. The plateau rewards systems that fail gracefully and punishes those that assume the road will always be there tomorrow. This is how control breathes at altitude, not as a blanket, but as a set of arteries. Keep oxygen, literal and logistical, flowing through those narrow corridors, and the silence between them cooperates. Let one artery clot, and distance, weather, and thin air turn a small problem into a region-wide story. Emptiness reduces variables, but it magnifies the cost of a single miss. Micro-story: a valley, a dam, a relocation. The order arrived on a Tuesday, stamped, signed, and folded like a verdict. Dorje's family had grazed yaks along this bend of the river for as long as anyone in the clan could remember. Winter wind carved the tents thin, summer grass rose to the knees of calves. The valley taught its calendar by taste, salt in the dust before rain, sweetness in the meltwater at dawn. Now the message said their pasture was inside a project boundary. Report to town. Compensation available. Deadline 30 days. They didn't argue the mountains, they argued the numbers. A man from the bureau sat on a folding chair, pen neat, boots new. He explained the stipend for livestock reduction, the apartment key, the school slot for their daughter, the clinic 2 streets over. He used words like ecological restoration and public good. He didn't say hydropower. He didn't need to. Upstream, a concrete spine had already risen, cranes pecking at the sky. Everyone heard the trucks at night. Moving day felt smaller than the decision. One load on a flatbed, kettles, prayer flags, a trunk of wool. The saddle Dorje's father had restitched after a blizzard. The herd they couldn't keep went cheap to a cousin across the ridge who still had quota. The tent poles stayed with the valley. In town, a caretaker led them up a stairwell that smelled like fresh paint and old dust. The window looked east, toward a slope that meant home, now framed like a picture. At the dam, the gates learned the river. The first time engineers pulsed the turbines, the valley's sound changed, lower, steadier, missing the old chatter of stones. Fishers downstream waited for the color shift that used to mark a healthy surge. It came late. Nets lifted thin. Fields that took water by ear, listening to the murmur under the bank, found the murmur had a timetable. Dorje's brother-in-law, who cut channels to the barley by habit and hand, started checking a posted schedule he didn't trust. Dorje found work on the access road crew. He wore an orange vest and steel-toed boots and learned to nod at a foreman who spoke with a city cadence. The pay was regular. The headaches were regular too, a reminder that the town sat higher than comfort and lower than pride. His wife, Suring, liked the clinic and the certainty of tap water. She volunteered at the school, where her daughter read about rivers in a textbook that didn't know this valley's jokes. On festival day, the monastery's drummers echoed in a square hemmed by barriers. The old kora around a hillside shrine now crossed a fence topped with a camera. People walked in loops shorter than memory. An officer in a padded jacket smiled and waved them through. The butter lamps flickered in sanctioned wind. Once a month, Dorje rode his motorbike to the dam overlook. He told himself he was checking on friends, but he counted eddies like a man counting old debts. The spillway gleamed. The reservoir stretched back into gorges that used to open as summer pastures. He could name the saddles under that water, where the lambs once lost their fear, where a cousin proposed on a night when the Milky Way looked close enough to graze. The stipend hit their account on time. The forms multiplied. Inspectors visited the apartment to verify occupancy. A poster in the stairwell displayed targets met, hectares restored, kilowatts generated, households relocated. It didn't list the taste of the wind or the way a grandmother mapped the valley with stories about a fox that always stayed one ridge ahead of the hunters. The river taught the town a new calendar. Lights brightened when turbines peaked in the evening, fans hummed against thin air, trucks idled under the substation's fence while drivers traded gossip about another cascade planned upriver. A grocer stacked tomatoes beside oxygen canisters. Prices pulsed like the dam. One autumn, a sudden release met an early storm. The valley took the hit in brown foam. A footbridge snapped. The crew Dorje knew pulled night duty, resetting stones, pouring concrete until their breath turned ragged. The next week, officials handed out blankets and forms. Relief accounted, loss acknowledged, cause unspecified. Elders tried to translate. They drew maps on cardboard. Winter camp here, lambing hollow there, the shortcut across the scree we used when clouds pressed low. Kids nodded, then looked down at screens. The maps folded into a closet. Years later, Dorje still kept a small habit. He touched the radiator at dawn to feel whether the river was working. Warm meant gates had turned, a silent handshake between concrete and town. Cold meant a long day and a call to the foreman about shifts. That was the new pact, a pulse traded for a paycheck, a valley traded for a view. One relocation order had rerouted a lineage and a river, and the empty pasture learned to echo without them. Strategic void, why emptiness endures. Step back from the valleys and look at the map the way a planner does. The empty spaces aren't gaps to be filled, they're working parts of a larger machine. Start with the military cushion. At altitude, speed is oxygen and predictability. Fewer civilians near corridors and borders lowers the political cost of a patrol gone wrong, a road closure, or a sudden redeployment. Evacuation lists are shorter. rumors have fewer kitchens to multiply in. Commanders can accept delays that would be intolerable in a crowded plane, because there's less human collateral tethered to each decision. Altitude turns that cushion into a home field edge. Units based high adapt their blood, their routines, their maintenance. Corridors supply them on a timetable the state controls. Keeping the grasslands thin keeps the network legible. A dust plume on an otherwise empty slope reads like punctuation. Satellites pick out a new shed. A bridge appears where last week there was ice. Emptiness makes surveillance cheap and deception costly, a quiet deterrent that doesn't need a press release. Then there's the hydrological lever. To time water, you need jaws on the river, dams, gauges, access roads, and enough calm around them to operate without local friction. Sparse settlement along headwaters lowers the number of compensation packages, court cases, and surprise vetoes. It also lowers risk. A glacial lake outburst flood or an emergency spill from a peaking plant hits fewer homes when the valley floor is mostly pasture. Emptiness reduces the humanitarian tail on Hydropower's engineering head. Administrative efficiency layers on top. Corridor urbanization, stacking people, services, and power in nodes, lets budgets work where oxygen and physics already cooperate. Schools, clinics, and markets reach more people per kilometer of asphalt when they're clumped. Inspectors visit 10 buildings in a morning instead of 10 encampments in 2 days. Welfare delivery runs through accounts, not caravans. Governance hardens along rails and wires, while the open plateaus stay quiet and easy to count. Economic limits seal the choice. Oxygen caps productivity, derates engines, and stretches timelines. Industries that thrive on scale and just-in-time supply stumble away from valleys. So planners lean into sectors that make altitude pay: hydropower, logistics, mining near corridors, tourism that peaks in seasons the roads can handle. Subsidies keep nodes warm and stocked. The spaces between remain expensive to populate and cheap to monitor. The result isn't failure to develop. It's a map that keeps growth where margins survive. Culture and compliance intersect in that space. Fewer herders on seasonal circuits, more residents in apartments by permit, and rituals tied to town squares rather than lonely shrines mean movement loses its unpredictability. A festival becomes a file with an approved route. A pilgrimage becomes a bus manifest. Emptiness behaves like a regulator. Its smooth social flows the same way a reservoir smooths water, turning spikes into manageable waves. Climate pressure tightens the screws. With glaciers thinning and permafrost warming, volatility rises. That argues for storability, reservoirs, wetlands, stockpiles, and for repairability, corridors that can be reopened fast. A sparse hinterland makes both easier. Fewer settlements to flood-proof, fewer wells to deepen, more room to steer a new levee without bulldozing a neighborhood. The same emptiness that once signaled absence now reads as resilience by design. Put these logics together, and the strategic void stops looking like a leftover. It's a tool. It buffers borders without crowds to endanger. It backs water control with fewer moving parts. It makes administration measurable and security legible. It fits the physics of altitude and the economics of cost curves. And because the plateau's rivers drain into countries that hold hundreds of millions of lives, the tool's reach extends far beyond the fence line. That creates a hard truth. The less populated the high ground, the more power concentrates in the corridors, and the more the downstream world depends on choices made where the wind carries only thin air. Emptiness endures because it works, for movement, for timing, for control. The price is paid in places where streets replace trails, and in deltas that set their calendars by gates they'll never see. Resolution and broader meaning. A near-empty plateau now times rivers for half a continent and buffers a border that never sleeps. The quiet choice to keep it sparse shapes power, prices, and peace far beyond the ridgelines. If you want the next chapter, how Arctic melt, Russian rivers, and Greenland's ice can redraw freight lanes and fuel new water politics, watch the video on your screen. Subscribe to GeoQuest and turn on notifications so you don't miss the stories that decide maps before ink ever touches paper.